December 17, 1944, 0530 hours, Honsfeld, Belgium. The brutal cold of the pre-dawn Ardennes pierced the heavy wool uniforms of the Waffen SS soldiers, but a far deeper chill gripped the command tank of SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper. The 700-horsepower Maybach engine of his formidable Tiger tank sputtered, coughed violently, and then fell silent. Peiper, one of the youngest and most decorated regimental commanders in the Wehrmacht, slammed his armored fist against the turret hatch, the metallic clang echoing unnaturally in the freezing quiet. Below him, his driver, Unterscharführer Weber, called up from the driving compartment, his voice laced with tightly controlled panic, "Herr Obersturmbannführer, the reserve tank is also dry?" Nothing. The spearhead of Germany's most powerful armored thrust in the Ardennes offensive, codenamed Operation Watch on the Rhine, sat frozen in the desolate Belgian landscape around Peiper's immobilized command vehicle, the devastating power of his Kampfgruppe, consisting of 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and nearly 5,000 of the Reich's most elite soldiers, was rendered utterly inert, paralyzed by the simple, insurmountable reality of empty fuel tanks. Through the cold morning mist, Peiper could just make out the empty American positions ahead. His unit had reached the outskirts of Honsfeld, an important supply point for the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. The Americans had fled so quickly that it didn't seem real. Fires still burned in makeshift oil drum heaters, and cups of coffee sat steaming on tables as if their owners might return any second. Everything about the scene looked rushed, almost panicked, yet what they left behind told a very different story. All around, stretching as far as the eye could see, were endless rows of olive-green fuel containers, thousands of them, perfectly lined up in neat military order. Peiper climbed down from his tank, his boots crunching the frozen ground. He walked toward the stockpile, staring in disbelief. His adjutant, Hans Gruller, hurried to one of the cans, cracked it open, and sniffed. His eyes lit up. "Gasoline, sir," he said, "high octane." At once the soldiers went to work. With shouts of relief, they began transferring the precious fuel into their own vehicles. Engines rumbled to life as hoses and funnels appeared from nowhere. Peiper moved among them slowly, doing the math in his head. There had to be at least 50,000 gallons here, enough to power his entire armored group all the way to the Meuse River. The find was almost unbelievable. In a war where every drop of fuel was rationed, this single discovery could keep their offensive alive for days. To Peiper, it felt like a miracle fallen from the sky. But as he watched his men celebrate, a darker thought began to take hold. The more he looked at the vast field of abandoned cans, the heavier the realization became. The Americans hadn't fled in fear. They had simply left behind what they didn't need. To them, this massive supply of fuel was expendable. Peiper understood then how wide the gap between the two sides had truly become. Germany's entire army could have fought for months on what the Americans had just walked away from. The Reich wasn't just short on resources. It had misjudged the entire war. It wasn't a battle of courage anymore, but a battle of industry, and Germany was hopelessly outmatched. Standing in the mist, surrounded by roaring engines and the smell of stolen gasoline, Peiper felt the weight of that truth settle over him. The fuel that had saved them in that moment also proved something far worse than the war. In the larger sense, was already lost. The Americans could afford to abandon what Germany could no longer even dream of producing, and that, Peiper knew, was the real difference between victory and defeat. By the winter of 1944, the contrast between the resource-strapped Wehrmacht and the fuel-soaked American war machine had grown into a chasm that no amount of German discipline or daring could bridge. The sheer volume of American abundance stood in grotesque contrast to the suffocating scarcity that now defined every German offensive. Nowhere was this imbalance more visible or more psychologically devastating then in Joachim Peiper's advance through the Ardennes. When his tanks rolled into Honsfeld and discovered thousands of neatly lined American fuel cans, it was more than luck. It was a grim symbol of a war Germany had already lost, even if no one on their side was ready to admit it. 6 months before Peiper's discovery, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, had presented a report that could have rewritten the course of the war if the regime had been capable of rational acceptance. His data was unflinching. Germany's synthetic fuel production, the fragile artery keeping its mechanized divisions alive, had been shattered by relentless Allied bombing. The vast Leuna works, once capable of producing 175,000 tons of fuel in a single month, were crawling at barely 5,000 tons by September 1944. Other critical hydrogenation plants, Politz, Blechhammer, and Brooks, operated at less than a tenth of their intended capacity. The Reich's industrial core had become a skeleton, its factories limping along under constant aerial siege. The math was damning. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil, an almost unthinkable number. Germany, by comparison, including every drop of synthetic fuel and all petroleum captured from Romania, barely scraped together 33 million barrels, less than 2% of America's total output. The strategic implications were staggering. The Third Reich was fighting a modern, mechanized war with 1930s logistics, its tank divisions relying more on horses than on actual fuel trucks. Peiper's tanks and half-tracks were roaring steel symbols of a delusion that precision, aggression, and tactical surprise could substitute for the crude arithmetic of industrial power. The entire concept of the Ardennes offensive was built on a fragile fantasy. Major Friedrich Simon, a meticulous officer in the Wehrmacht's logistics command, had calculated that the drive to Antwerp, the operation's ultimate goal, required 4.5 million gallons of fuel. Hitler allocated 5 million. But thanks to bombed railways, broken bridges, and Allied air superiority, barely half ever reached the front lines. It meant one thing: success depended entirely on capturing American fuel dumps. The offensive, grand in ambition, was tactically dependent on theft. Peiper knew this better than anyone. At only 29, he was already one of the Reich's most formidable young officers, a battle-hardened veteran of the Eastern Front, decorated with the Knight's Cross, with oak leaves and swords. He had witnessed firsthand that in modern warfare, fuel outranked ammunition. Without it, the most fearsome tank was just a metal coffin. As commander of Kampfgruppe Peiper, the designated Schwerpunkt, or spearhead, of the entire Ardennes offensive, his orders were clear: lead the charge, reach the Meuse River, and carve a path for the panzer columns that would drive the Allies apart. But even before the operation began, he understood that every mile gained came at a cost, measured in gasoline, not blood. During the final briefing at Tondorf on December 14, 1944, his superior, General Sepp Dietrich of the 6th SS Panzer Army, had been brutally direct. You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies. The implication was chilling. They would run dry long before their objective unless they seized what the enemy left behind. Kampfgruppe Peiper's initial allocation of 31,000 gallons was barely enough for 50 miles of combat movement, yet the Meuse lay 65 miles away. The math of failure was written into the plan itself. So Peiper prepared accordingly. He drilled his men on conservation. Tanks were to move in a single file to minimize consumption. Engines were to be shut down during every halt longer than 5 minutes. Every captured American fuel dump became a target of the highest priority, even higher than tactical objectives or enemy positions. Their survival was tethered to what they could seize. Meanwhile, the Americans operated with a carelessness born of abundance. Just 20 miles away from Peiper's start line, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion made a casual note in his unit diary on December 16th, the morning of the offensive. Received fuel resupply 8,000 gallons. Third delivery this week. Storage tanks are already at capacity. That single sentence captured the asymmetry of the war. The Americans were drowning in fuel, struggling to find space for it, while the Germans were launching one of the largest offensives of the war on fumes. By the time Peiper's tanks reached Honsfeld and found the abandoned American depot, the psychological weight of that imbalance could not be ignored. Fires still burned in oil drum heaters, coffee remained warm in metal cups. The retreat had been so fast it seemed panicked. Yet the true message wasn't in the speed of withdrawal, it was in what had been left behind. The Americans could afford to abandon 50,000 gallons of gasoline without blinking. For the Germans, that quantity was enough to fuel an entire division for weeks. As Peiper's men frantically siphoned the fuel, laughing in disbelief at their luck, he walked among the rows of jerry cans and felt something colder than the winter air settle over him. It wasn't triumph. It was recognition. The Americans could leave behind what his army would kill to possess. That wasn't just tactical disparity. It was existential defeat. Germany had gambled on capturing the industrial spoils of a nation whose output dwarfed that of its entire continent. The war had already tipped irreversibly toward one side, not because of courage or genius or strategy, but because one side could build and burn, and build again without fear of running out. Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld wasn't just about fuel. It was about the realization that the Wehrmacht's final gamble had been made on empty tanks. The Reich had misjudged its enemy not on the battlefield, but in the factories, refineries, and endless supply lines that defined modern warfare. When Peiper stood amid the rows of American jerry cans, he was looking at more than gasoline. He was staring at the material embodiment of defeat. The war for Europe had become a war of production, and in that war, Germany had already burned its last drop. The German artillery barrage that launched Operation Watch on the Rhine at 0530 hours on December 16th used more ammunition in 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had sometimes allocated for entire campaigns earlier in the war, a display of temporary fury that masked a profound structural weakness. Peiper's column began moving 2 hours behind schedule at 7 a.m. The roads that appeared as wide highways on German military maps were, in fact, narrow, unpaved country lanes, often struggling under the weight of the massive armored vehicles. Within hours, crushing traffic jams developed as the German vehicles, designed primarily for the vast, open Russian steppes, struggled to navigate the cramped, choked confines of the Ardennes forest. At Lanzerath, Peiper's first critical objective, the column encountered utterly unexpected and fierce resistance. A single, small American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, just 18 soldiers, managed to hold up the most powerful German armored spearhead for nearly 10 hours. During this punishing delay, Peiper's vehicles sat idling, burning precious, irreplaceable fuel. When they finally broke through and reached Honsfeld at dawn on December 17th, the column had covered only 20 miles, but had already consumed 40% of its desperately small fuel allocation. At this catastrophic rate of consumption, they would be immobilized before even reaching the halfway point to the Meuse River. The American supply depot at Honsfeld was not even designated a major facility. It was merely a forward supply point for the 99th Infantry Division, classified by the U.S. Army as a Class 3B depot, a temporary minor fuel station, yet the bounty Peiper discovered exceeded the entire monthly fuel allocation of a German panzer division. Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruller later testified, describing the scene with vivid disbelief. "We found pyramids of jerry cans, each containing 5 gallons of gasoline. They were stacked 3 meters high, extending for perhaps 200 meters. The Americans had not even attempted to destroy them. The captured fuel was high-octane aviation gasoline mixed with motor fuel that registered 80 octane or higher. This abundance was so superior that it was actually too good for the temperamental German Maybach engines in the Tiger tanks, which were optimized for 74 octane fuel, causing minor performance issues in several vehicles. As Peiper's weary men refueled, they made discoveries that compounded their commander's sinking realization. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, who had worked in his father's import business before the conflict and could read English, found shipping manifests in the depot office. The papers meticulously detailed the fuel's epic journey, shipped from Texas to New York, across the volatile Atlantic to Liverpool, across the Channel to Normandy, and finally trucked 400 miles to Honsfeld. The total journey spanned over 6,000 miles, yet it had taken less than 6 weeks. "I showed the papers to Obersturmbannführer Peiper," Hoffmann recalled in a post-war interview. "He read them twice, then crumpled them up. He said nothing, but his face went pale. We both understood what this meant." Private Ernst Kara, meanwhile, found a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers, dated December 15th, just 2 days old. The celebratory headline heralded the opening of a brand-new fuel pipeline running from Cherbourg to Verdun, boasting a delivery capacity of 300,000 gallons per day. A single, temporary pipeline system was delivering more fuel daily than Kampfgruppe Peiper was allocated for the entire decisive offensive. To fully grasp the strategic shock of Peiper's discovery, one must acknowledge the catastrophic decline of Germany's fuel situation by late 1944. Since May, Allied bombing campaigns had systematically reduced synthetic fuel production by 90%. The Luftwaffe, once the terrifying spearhead of Hitler's early victories, was now forced to ground large numbers of aircraft due to the simple lack of aviation fuel. Pilot training, once extensive, had been brutally slashed from 250 flight hours to a dangerous 60 hours. The German Navy's surface fleet had effectively ceased all major operational deployments, and U-boats were hastily retrofitted with snorkels to conserve precious diesel by operating longer on battery power. On the home front, the scarcity was palpable and profound. German civilians had not seen private automobile traffic since 1942. Gasoline had become so valuable that the Gestapo dedicated resources to investigating the black market theft of individual liters. Farmers were returning to antiquated horse-drawn plows. Meanwhile, the United States was refining 67% of the world's oil. The East Texas oil field alone produced more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe combined. American refineries were operating at such staggering capacity that industrial giants like Standard Oil were experimenting with new petroleum byproducts simply because they were inundated with excess crude oil. It was into this abyss of production disparity that Peiper's column temporarily surged forward, buoyed by the 50,000 gallons captured at Honsfeld. They reached Billingen by noon on December 17th, capturing additional supplies, rations, ammunition, and, most critically, maps that indicated the locations of other American fuel depots in the region. However, these captured maps revealed an even more disturbing truth. The Americans maintained massive fuel stockpiles everywhere. Every major crossroads seemed to house a depot. The U.S. First Army alone held 3.5 million gallons in reserve. Peiper pushed his men relentlessly toward Stavelot, the reported site of a major American fuel depot that was rumored to contain over 2 million gallons. Here, he believed, was enough fuel to guarantee reaching the Meuse and perhaps even securing the victory Hitler desperately craved. But as the first German vehicles approached Stavelot, they were too late. American engineers were already mobilized. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had received advance warning of the German approach, and his orders were chillingly simple. Deny the fuel to the enemy at all costs. The Stavelot depot housed an astonishing 2,189,000 gallons of gasoline stacked in jerry cans across 15 acres. At 16:30 hours on December 17th, as Peiper's advanced guard neared the depot, Captain Brewster issued the final command. Engineers rapidly poured gasoline trails between the colossal stacks, and white phosphorus grenades were quickly distributed. Technical Sergeant Paul Solis threw the first grenade. The explosion was immediate and tremendous, Solis recalled. A wall of fire shot up, maybe 100 feet. Within minutes, the entire depot, 2 million gallons of petroleum, was engulfed in a raging inferno. Peiper's lead tanks arrived to find an apocalyptic scene, a pillar of oily black smoke rising 1,000 feet into the sky. The fire would burn uncontrollably for 3 days, consuming enough fuel to have powered Peiper's entire division to Antwerp and safely back again. Unterscharführer Weber described his commander's reaction. The Obersturmbannführer stood on his tank turret watching the flames. He said nothing for perhaps 5 minutes. Then he climbed down and told me, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons to deny them to us. What are we doing here?" The Stavelot blaze was not an isolated incident. It was a policy rooted in absolute abundance. Across the Ardennes, American engineers were systematically destroying fuel dumps rather than risking capture by the desperately advancing Germans. At Tapan, 1.1 million gallons were consumed by intentional fire, and at Spa, 2.5 million gallons were destroyed. In total, the Americans deliberately obliterated over 8 million gallons of gasoline during the first week of the offensive, a volume greater than Germany had allocated for the entire operation. This capacity to casually destroy millions of gallons was underpinned by a supply system that defied German comprehension. The Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system, utilized 6,000 trucks operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, delivering 412,000 tons of supplies. Each truck consumed 40 gallons of fuel daily, meaning the operation itself burned more petroleum than German Army Group B received in an entire month. By December 1944, the Motor Transport Service employed 230 truck companies, operating on a sophisticated network of color-coded routes, delivering 20,000 tons of supplies daily, including 3,000 tons of fuel. The logistical reports confirmed the American advantage. Colonel James Snyder, Chief Logistics Officer for the First Army, recorded on December 18th, "Fuel receipts yesterday 1,847,000 gallons. Fuel issued 1,623,000 gallons. Net gain to reserves 224,000 gallons." The Allies were accumulating reserves even as they fought a massive defensive battle. The pipeline network was even more impressive. Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, had laid pipes across the English Channel, pumping 1 million gallons daily from Britain. This integrated network extended inland, with the Cherbourg-Paris line delivering 800,000 gallons daily and the Seine line moving 650,000 gallons. By December 1944, Allied forces in Northwest Europe were consuming 7.5 million gallons of fuel daily, but receiving 8.2 million gallons, meaning they were actively building reserves during active offensive operations. As Peiper pushed deeper into Belgium on December 18th, the utter impossibility of the German position became devastatingly clear. At La Glaise, they captured yet another depot, 5,000 gallons consumed in 3 hours of combat. The fuel consumption rates of the German heavy armor were crippling. Tiger tanks devoured 2.5 gallons per mile in battle, while Panthers consumed 1.5 gallons per mile. In the difficult, uneven terrain of the Ardennes, this consumption increased by 40%. Hauptfeldwebel Otto Dingler, maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, recorded the grim arithmetic. "By noon on December 18th, We had consumed 67,000 gallons since the offensive began. We had captured perhaps 55,000 gallons. We were operating at a deficit. The Americans, monitoring German radio traffic through ultra-intercepts, knew precisely how desperate Peiper's fuel situation had become. General Courtney Hodges, commanding the First Army, issued unambiguous orders: enemy critically short of fuel, destroy all gasoline stocks threatened by capture. That same day, American C-47 transport aircraft flew 316 sorties, delivering vital supplies to the surrounded garrison at Bastogne, including 160,000 gallons of fuel. The Americans were airlifting more fuel to a single surrounded position than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe possessed. By December 19th, as Peiper's forces engaged defenders at Stoumont, the fuel crisis was terminal. Tanks were being abandoned with empty tanks. Rather than from actual battle damage, Peiper consolidated his remaining supply, perhaps 8,000 gallons, enough for one final engagement or a single desperate retreat, but not both. Meanwhile, Allied planners were effortlessly preparing for January operations. Brigadier General Morris Gilland requested 245 million gallons for the coming month. The request was approved without any internal discussion. The contrast extended beyond mere quantity to fundamental industrial standardization. American vehicles were designed for interchangeable efficiency. Sherman tanks consumed 0.8 gallons per mile compared to the Tiger's 2.5 gallons. American trucks achieved 8 miles per gallon fully loaded, and parts were standardized and maintenance simplified. German forces, by contrast, relied on a bewildering array of captured and manufactured vehicles with disparate maintenance requirements. French tanks needed a different oil than German Panthers, and Soviet trucks required specialized parts distinct from German Opels. Each complication multiplied the logistical difficulties exponentially. On December 20th, Peiper received a crushing radio message: fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply possible. Continue with available resources. Peiper called his commanders together. Sturmbannführer Werner Pötschke was brutally blunt. We have fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30 kilometers away. According to Hauptsturmführer Grüller's later testimony, the Obersturmbannführer's statement to his men encapsulated the entire strategic defeat. Gentlemen, we have discovered we are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we received for this entire operation. What we captured at Honsfeld, which seemed miraculous, was nothing to them. We cannot win. This crushing realization was not confined to Peiper's isolated command. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, later committed his despair to writing, "When I learned Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons rather than risk our capturing it, I knew the offensive had failed before it began." Colonel Friedrich von Denoter, captured on December 23rd, told his American interrogators, "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men haven't seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons. We measure by the liter. How can we fight such abundance?" By December 21st, Peiper was surrounded at La Glaise, his tanks immobilized. The American forces surrounding him, the 30th Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne, and the 3rd Armored Division, had a combined fuel allocation of 340,000 gallons. For December 21st alone, Peiper had perhaps 1,000 gallons. Private First Class Richard McKinney, riding home, captured the absurd irony. "We've got Germans surrounded who ran out of gas. Our captain jokes we use more fuel heating coffee than they have for tanks." The American response demonstrated industrial warfare at its peak. General Patton's Third Army pivot north required 350,000 gallons just for the redeployment, an operational maneuver considered impossible by German military standards, yet accomplished in 3 days. December 23rd brought clear weather, and Allied aircraft flew 2,000 sorties, each burning fuel at rates that would have completely grounded the Luftwaffe for weeks. P-47 fighter bombers consumed 300 gallons per hour, and B-26 medium bombers burned 200 gallons hourly. One day's air operations consumed more fuel than Germany had allocated for the entire offensive. On the night of December 23rd to 24th, Peiper abandoned his immobilized vehicles and escaped on foot. Of the 119 tanks and assault guns that had begun the offensive, only 39 remained operational, and these were all immobilized, eventually destroyed with the remaining ammunition. Oberleutnant Heinz Goels described the desperate scene. "We drained the last fuel from all vehicles, maybe 200 gallons total. The Obersturmbannführer personally destroyed his command tank. Millions of Reichsmarks worth of equipment were destroyed, rendered useless solely by empty fuel tanks." Of the 5,000 men who began with the Kampfgruppe, approximately 770 returned. They had advanced 60 miles, captured several depots, and ultimately discovered the devastating truth about Allied logistics. News of Peiper's discoveries spread rapidly through the German High Command. On December 26th, Field Marshal Walter Model received detailed reports on the captured American supplies. His chief of staff recorded Model's reaction. The Field Marshal read the quantities twice: 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld, 2 million burned at Stavelot, 8 million destroyed rather than captured. Model reportedly said, "We are not fighting the same war." Hitler, informed on December 28th, refused to accept this reality. Speer wrote that Hitler insisted the numbers were propaganda. When shown photographs of burning Stavelot, he claimed it was Hollywood effects. But the lower ranks understood the immutable truth. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife, "Americans destroy more fuel daily than we receive monthly. They drive tanks like we march. This war is lost." The fuel crisis was a grim symptom of a colossal structural disparity. By 1944, America produced 50% of the world's manufacturing output. A new aircraft was completed every 5 minutes, a ship daily, and a tank every 7 minutes. The petroleum production statistics were overwhelming. The United States, 1.8 billion barrels. The Soviet Union, 110 million barrels. Germany, including synthetic production, 33 million barrels. Japan, 2.6 million barrels. The Axis powers combined produced less than 2% of the petroleum available to the Americans. Every major German offensive after 1942 had been severely constrained by fuel shortages. Every American offensive, by contrast, was supported by absolute abundance. German planners simply could not conceive of the scale of the enemy's reserves. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen recorded a revealing incident on December 27th. A logistics officer reported that bad weather had reduced fuel deliveries to only 500,000 gallons daily. There was concern until someone noted that this exceeded Germany's total offensive allocation. German prisoners of war captured in the Ardennes were often more shocked by American waste than by Allied firepower. Seeing GIs discard half-eaten rations or use copious amounts of gasoline merely for heating shattered morale more effectively than artillery barrages. Aust gar Reichelm told interrogators, "We knew your production numbers abstractly, but seeing soldiers waste more than we possessed made them real. Every German who saw your casual abundance knew the war was hopeless." This knowledge spread rapidly, undermining the myth of German superiority. During the Nuremberg trials, German military leaders consistently cited logistics, particularly the fuel deficiency, as the decisive factor. Field Marshal Keitel testified, "We had operational superiority 1940 to 41. By 1944, we couldn't move forces for lack of fuel, while Americans moved armies like chess pieces." Peiper, during his own testimony, offered a chilling assessment. Every decision after December 17th was influenced by fuel shortage. We couldn't maneuver, pursue, or retreat effectively. Americans moved freely while we counted liters. General Heinz Guderian wrote that when Peiper captured 50,000 gallons, which meant everything to him but nothing to the Americans, the war was over. The story resonates because it marks the true conclusion of industrial warfare. The romantic notion of the warrior ethos died in the Ardennes, extinguished among empty fuel tanks. Dr. Richard Overy calculated that by 1944, Allied to Axis production ratios exceeded 5-to-1 in major categories, but in petroleum it approached 50-to-1. These overwhelming advantages could not be overcome by superior training or tactical skill. America produced 324,750 aircraft during the war. Germany, 119,970. Americans built 88,410 tanks. Germans built 46,857. But the most telling statistic remained petroleum. America refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944 alone, while Germany scraped together 33 million barrels. December 24, 1944. As Peiper's men slipped through American lines on foot, abandoning 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 other vehicles, the magnitude of the disparity crystallized. They had captured 50,000 gallons, a seemingly miraculous bounty, only to discover that it was utterly meaningless to an enemy who could intentionally burn millions, Unterscharführer Weber reflected years later. That morning at Honsfeld, finding American fuel, we celebrated like winning the lottery. By evening, learning about Stavelot burning, we understood we'd already lost. The 50,000 gallons was less than a single American armored division consumed in 2 days, less than the Red Ball Express burned in 3 hours, a rounding error in Allied daily consumption. The Germans' desperate attempts to capture fuel revealed their fundamental miscalculation. They assumed the Americans valued fuel as they did, as an irreplaceable resource. They could not comprehend that the Allies possessed so much that they could destroy millions of gallons rather than risk a minor tactical disadvantage. Operation Watch on the Rhine failed due to the immutable mathematics of industrial warfare. The offensive consumed approximately 2.8 million gallons, 40% of the overall allocation. During the same period, Americans consumed 267 million gallons, nearly 100 times more. The ability of the Allies to treat millions of gallons of fuel with indifference while the Germans reserved it for individual cans spoke volumes. Beyond mere quantity, American fuel represented technological superiority. American refineries perfected catalytic cracking, producing higher octanes more efficiently than German hydrogenation processes. American 100-octane aviation fuel gave Allied aircraft a performance edge over German planes running 87-octane synthetic fuel. German engines, optimized for lower quality fuel, often ran poorly on the captured American gasoline. The human impact was profound. German medical services were crippled, ambulances could not evacuate the wounded, and hospitals could not run on generators. Men died who could have been saved with 10 kilometers of transport, all for lack of fuel. The discoveries shattered German propaganda about American weakness. Goebbels' diary noted reports indicating serious morale problems as soldiers wrote about American superiority. Undermining the official narrative, the myth of German superiority could not survive contact with American logistics. The Ardennes failure meant Germany was left with no options except desperate defense. General Jodl testified at Nuremberg, "After the Ardennes, we knew it was lost. We'd played our last card and discovered the enemy held all aces." The spring of 1945 brought surreal scenes. Entire panzer divisions sat helplessly immobile as Allied forces drove past them. As Major General Fritz Belein described, We had 42 operational tanks, experienced crews, ammunition. We had 300 liters of fuel, not enough for the next town. We destroyed our tanks and walked to captivity. The ultimate irony was uncovered at La Glaise. American forces cataloging the abandoned equipment found 39 perfect, highly valuable German tanks, abandoned solely for lack of fuel. Major Robert Harrison's salvage report noted the requirements to save them. Fuel required, 8,000 gallons. Classification, minimal. Source, local reserve. Time, 4 hours. What was impossible for the Germans, 8,000 gallons to save their best tanks, was beneath American notice, a minor request easily filled from local reserves. Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld, therefore, was not merely about a few thousand gallons of gas. It was the moment when the mathematical reality of American industrial capacity, mobilized fully for war, became undeniably apparent. Honsfeld revealed what had been true since 1942. Germany was fighting the impossible, measuring its defeat in gallons, while America measured its victory in oceans. The Tiger tank rests today in the La Glaise Museum, its fuel gauge permanently set to empty, a silent, immobile monument to the brutal moment when tactical excellence met logistical reality and lost. We recall the haunting exchange between former German soldier Karl Wortmann and American Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson years later at a veterans gathering. Anderson confessed, "We never knew you were that short. We had so much we never thought about it." Wortmann laughed bitterly. "We stopped because the tanks were empty. You burned millions to keep it from us. How could we fight that?" This final realization that the enemy could casually waste what you would willingly die to possess shattered the illusions of the master race and exposed the final fatal weakness of the Third Reich. The story of the captured 50,000 gallons is a testament to the industrial scale of the Second World War. It was a conflict won not by the genius of generals or the courage of warriors, but by the relentless, overwhelming productivity of factories and refineries. In a world perpetually grappling with scarcity and resource conflicts, the fate of Peiper's Kampfgruppe compels us to reflect. Are modern conflicts still determined by the moral fortitude of the fighting force, or have we fully entered an era where victory is, and forever will be, predetermined by the sheer, unassailable might of industrial and logistical abundance? The empty tank at La Glaise whispers a cold answer.